And so, early discussions are really framed around the evidence that linguistics provides on modularity. If you go and read a book on, modularity now, linguistics might not even be a chapter in there. The debate has moved on, and it's now dominated by psychology, it's dominated by biology, neuroscience, and you know what? The consensus is the brain is modular. We all know that. The brain is specialized tissue to deal with particular things. So when we talk about something that's domain general, that might have been quite plausible in the 60s. But right now, actually, I don't know what domain general mechanisms are, because when you look at the reading, it seems that actually the brain has a whole lot of domain specific things. So in fact, I think that the null hypothesis has kind of shoes on the other foot now, right? So in the 60s, it was the generativists that actually made the claim, to say, well, why do we need innate stuff? Now I think it's the empiricists that have to actually, deal with that. Because the null hypothesis is, there is, there's domain-specific architecture. However, there are some things that worry me, when people talk about domain generality. It's not that language is complex. It's that it is quite specific what it is. Okay, so when you talk about, there are island constraints in language, right? It is something that seems to characterize language that doesn't, as far as I know, characterize any other cognitive domain. So how does that happen if we're just dealing with general constraints? When someone can show up the island constraints in, choose cognitive domain of choice, then I think that will be interesting. Then we can start the discussion about general cognitive constraints. Until then, I just don't really see how something that general can really come up with something specific like islandhood. If I was being nasty, and of course I wouldn't be nasty. So I won't say what I'm about to say. What I buy these domain general constraints? They just look to me like post-hoc rationalizations about thinking. So if I solve a problem and I kind of think, well, how did I do that? I'm going to come up with those things. Does that make them cognitive? I don't know. I think it's labels. Sorry. I feel bad now. Okay. With respect to the construction...
So you still have an intact ethical module?
Hardly. When it comes to constructions, I actually think that minimalists are radical constructionists. That is the construction underlying language. It is quite specific. It is X bar. Those constructions best put up there, I don't know what they are. They're presented as the fundamental unit of language acquisition, and that means they should be atomic in some way, but they've certainly got internal structure. So internal structure, internal structure because you can put something in X position there, right? And then when you have the what did X, I don't know, that construction there. The what must be co-indexed with something, right? So they clearly presupposes some kind of internal structure, which presupposes some kind of analysis. Now, that constructivist thing that was just put up there, not constructivist, construction grammarist, it just seems to me like, I don't know what those are. Are those like little chunks of words that people pick up, but don't analyze, but actually analyze? And the moment you say, well, yes, it does presuppose analysis, you come down to, well, what are they analyzed in terms of? What is the ontology of categories? And that is something that the native position can answer, right? And that is what it's analyzed in terms of hierarchy, X-bar theory, etc. And we can ask the same questions that used to be asked about the Chomsky position about parameters. We can ask about constructions. So how many of them are there actually? 10? 100? Is every sentence maybe its own construction? Are constructions only utterances, or can a verb phrase be a construction? What are the limits on these constructions? Are there constructions that cannot be constructions? So what I'm saying is, are there islands? Are there some constructions that just cannot be because they do not follow from it? Or is it anything goes? And then where do they come from? Are they perhaps constructed in discourse? Or actually are they in the brain? In which case, they're innate. So we can just start the discussion right there. So I don't know. I don't know really what to do with that. But to think of, like, I think L. Goldberg talked about the way construction. So something like, you know, Obama talked his way to the White House. And what's interesting about that, okay, it's kind of complex construction, but you can replace any of its constituent parts and it stays the construction. Right? So you can change talk to slept. You can take the direction, like, you know, to the White House, to the top. You can make it metaphoric. You can take the way and, you know, turn it into something else. So you can replace any of the parts of the construction. So the construction must be something more abstract than that. So, but what is it? I think it's X bar, really. I think that's what we need. Okay. Yeah, I think that's middle step. So lower level schema is more likely to store in the mind. Yeah, I agree. Okay. When it comes to the question about, you know, children acquire these little chunks of language and they put them together. Yeah, sure. That sounds like, you know, any one of a number of innatist language acquisition theories. There's nothing inherently empiricist about that. But I think what we've got to take seriously is the idea that, you know, sure, children might not use, I don't know, certain kind of construction commonly until they acquire literacy, but they do use it, right? If they can use it at all, it means they've got the apparatus to compute it. If they can understand their parents talking in that way, then they have the ability to compute it. If they've got the ability to compute it, it's part of their competence. So I think at this point, the object of study has morphed into something else, right? So nativists are interested in language competence, and people who might be doing this kind of study are perhaps thinking about its performance, right? How do we determine which structures are used in which context? And the moment you change the object of study, well, then we're talking apples and oranges, right? So there's nothing really to say about that. Okay. And then, you know, the origins of language is a big favorite of mine. I love this stuff. I wanted to be a paleontologist when I was young. And in primary school, I was called the fossil. It's a true story. So, yeah, you know, that's a perfectly plausible, you know, narrative about the evolution of language, as does the bow-wow hypothesis or the yo-he-ho, you know, the idea, you know, who knows? You know, unless you get some specificity out there and can make predictions about, you know, what structures did we say first? You know, what is possible, what is not possible? And to do that, you need a theory that has some predictive capacity. And you know, the Chomsky and minimalist thing perhaps does have that kind of thing, right? Don't want to really blow my own trumpet, but I also came up with a plausible narrative about language evolution that was couching what I would think is radical minimalism. So, I don't know, you know, it's like you say, I say, and ultimately, who knows? I don't know. I don't know if there's really much to say about that, other than, yeah. I do like the quote, "wonder tissue." I think it just obscures one thing. We're not talking about wonder tissue, it's wonder genes. Right, so the stuff that is genetically encoded must be in the genes somewhere. So it's not the tissue, it's at the subcellular level. And that's where I'm going to make the claim that that is where innate properties of grammar must lie. So it's not in the tissue, the you know, synaptic connectivity that creates innate language. It's in the gene itself. I don't know. End of random thoughts.
Thank you, Mark. I assume that's it.
Yeah.
That's your slide. I want to say three things. First
is that the competence performance distinction does not sit well with most functionalists. Because all the interesting stuff is relegated to performance. That's just pragmatics, you know. Let's deal with the form first and then we'll figure out the function later. So in terms of the point of departure of delimiting the object of study then, I think the empiricist camp simply does not sort of agree on the validity of the distinction drawn between the two. Second point I want to raise is I think one of the critical sort of domains that functionalists look for evidence is grammaticalization and gradual language change over time. The basic story is that for any new grammatical construction to arise, you have humble beginnings and then gradually a change until ultimately some constructions become quite general, but many of them don't make it to that quite general level. So you have a particular communicative need for which the speaker does not feel there is an adequate resource that comes to mind. There might be one in the language, but the speaker does not have access to that. So you take another structure, sometimes you don't even tweak it, sometimes you tweak it, and you use it to perform a new function. And if this catches on, then gradually it builds momentum. But typically it starts not from general categories, so something like whatever the existing structure is does not enter into the equation. So there is a certain teleology in the selection of a structure for a function. And then you have gradual change. So in this process that takes place over a couple of centuries very often, you don't need very deep principles to explain it. It's a two-stage process. First functional adaptation and then later on formal adjustment in the language might follow. So in this view, very general, very specific principles of linguistic organization are not regarded as important constraints. As long as the speaker can see the usefulness of a structure for a particular function, he or she might start to use it, and then the society is the judge. If enough other speakers are infected by this new contagious disease, then it becomes a new piece of grammar. If not, then it dies a quiet death. So there's social selection rather than sort of natural selection involved. But other than that, this kind of story is quite aligned with mainstream evolutionary thinking. That if you look at the development of a particular species, it's always gradual, it's always a case of a particular organ or a particular piece of anatomy comes to be used in a new function, and then gradually the selection is for a structure that performs that new function better until the species sort of changes its shape. So one obvious example going the other direction actually is trace the long history, of course, for which we don't have evidence other than fossils. But fossils are not very good evidence on the development of the eye as an organ. The early eyes didn't fossilize very well, just like early language. But then if certain species of fish go very deep into the ocean where the light does not penetrate it, then the eye is not very important. So there's no selective pressure, then it sort of dies off. But all of this is extremely gradual. So the idea of discreteness and of relatively rigid categories that drive the process, that's something where the empiricists, I think, tend to disagree and argue that these things are quite gradual and that function drives the selection of form rather than a sort of a template for a particular structure. So to get to your question on how many constructions there are, as many as a speaker needs to do the job, but a very large number. So there's a very gradual distinction between lexicon and construction in this view of language, not a very neat separation of the lexicon for all the unpredictable information and then all the really neatly structured parts in the computation. most empiricists don't believe that there are very many neatly structured parts.
Thank you very much. We can open the floor up now to questions and comments. And with each question or comment, you can just give both a chance to respond in their own way.
Yeah, I'm wondering about the issue of restrictions and including things like island effects, for example. So suppose I grant you, this is for you, right? So suppose I grant you that a kid can pick up things like recursion, for example, and start creating deep, layers of embedding, and actually also learn to extract from the bottom of those embeddings, right? But how does the child come to learn about the limitations on recursion? That is, that in some structures you can't actually cross the boundary when you do WH movement. This is not something you can possibly learn from positive evidence, right? Just from exposure to what you hear people say around you. And I've also never heard about any child who actually started doing these unlawful extractions and got corrected by his elders and, put back on the narrow path, right? So I wonder, on the strict empiricist view, it seems to be puzzling that these constraints should exist, right? So then your best route of self-defense would probably be to deny that they exist, or else come up with some kind of functionalist explanation, right? The way you shouldn't do this. But the thing is that some of these constraints are extremely subtle, right? In fact, linguists have spent years on trying to elucidate the formal nature of these effects, right? And it's very unclear to me how a child could sort of arrive at this, right? And merely from exposure to data, right, from the primary linguistic input. Another related question is about typology, right? Typologists typically have gaps in them, right? So there are two things about typologies. One thing is that there are gaps in them, right? So if you look at simple word order typologies, so you'll find that there are lots of SVO languages, there are also lots of SOV languages, there's a fair number of ESO. But if you look at the mirror images of those orders, right? Lots of SVO languages, but hardly any OBS, for example. Lots of SOV languages, but hardly any SOV languages, hardly any OBS languages, and so on, right? And why is that? I mean, I see no a priori reason, right, why, the mirror image word orders shouldn't serve the purpose of communications way equally well as the other way, right? Nonetheless, it seems that, languages sort of try to avoid being like that, right? And again, I don't see how, general purpose learning strategies would help understand these facts. Also, I don't see how they would help understand the Greenbergian type of universals, where you connect different properties. You show a correlation, right, between two independent properties, right? Again, I don't see really I can't imagine what an empiricist account of that, combined with maybe a functionalist approach, would look like. I imagine there might be some. So I'm asking you what you can tell me about.
I can answer the second question with more ease than the first question.
Okay.
But let's...
I'll take what I get.
I think the typical account for many of the relatively complex syntactic constraints, such as islands, would be that the templates, the constructional schemas that children extract, particularly early on, would not have very deep structure. So the issue would almost not arise, but then when they do occur in the data, and as Mark said, some of these more complex constructions can be understood by children, then clearly they must have access. And I think that's something that some of the functionalist accounts have not dealt with in any great depth. So it's something that has not been a very important part of the research agenda to many of us. Why not? Probably Because if we start from data, and these constructions are quite rare, then we'd first explain the things that happen quite a lot, and then deal with these later. We're not at later yet, but I don't think there's an extensive account for that yet. For the typological gaps, I think the typical prediction would be that you have a number of constraints that interact. So there's a tendency in human observation to focus on the agent, on the one moving, which is your typical transitive construction, the subject, the animate subject performing. That draws the attention first. So that's why subjects tend to precede objects.
Okay, that's what I was going to have to police it slightly.
So subjects tend to precede objects, but there is no very strong preference for how the verb should relate. So therefore the variability that we see is in the area where there are no strong external constraints to guide the process of verb first, verb between subject and object, verb after subject and object, are all sort of open to choice, whereas subject before verb is something we can motivate from human perspective taking, how you scan a scene. Mark, I don't know if you want to...
No, you know, it used to be the case that, you know, the Chomskyans were criticized for the distinction between core constructions and peripheral ones. And it sounds like Francis is retreating into that. You know, to talk about the idea of, you know, what can you learn from data, I actually don't think it really matters how rich or poor the stimulus is. Because, you know, in the chapter 1 of Andrew Carney's linguistics textbook, he has this neat little proof, which is probably easy to disprove. It shows that for any finite set of data, there's a very, very large number of possible alternative, possible analyses. Right? And this has actually been shown formally by Gold in 1967, who said that for even a finite state grammar, if you've got a finite set of data, it is unlearnable from text. And you know, we know language is way more complex, it's at least context sensitive. So if you can't learn a finite state grammar from a finite set of data, there's no way that you can learn a context sensitive one from a finite set of data. So, you know, for me, that you know, these are important facts. That says, you know, you can't, the data is so varied and there's so much complicated stuff going on. There's just no way you're going to converge on the data, on the analysis just by looking at it. And the chance of you and me and our kids converging on the same analysis is just beggars imagination. So that's all I've got to say.
Oh, sorry, Christine?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the specifics of Verhafen's analysis of Dutch. Could we have that slide again, please? So the embedded questions, how it seems to me, unless I've misunderstood it, so these are just regular.
So you've got the WH.
So we don't have a full sentence, but that seems, even if that's really restricted in Dutch, that seems that I can do that with any kind of combination of verb and subject in German, right? Or is this something more specific that I missed since we didn't have the actual example?
No, I have not brought Verhafen along, so I can't give you more of these examples.
Okay.
The point is, if you look at the data in the English and Dutch corpus you analyze, when this WH extraction question occurs, so where the WH element is traditionally attributed to the embedded clause, that was actually those examples, those two, 1A and 1B. When they do occur, they occur usually with the verb to think, and they usually occur with a second person pronoun. So, sort of, also in response to your question of multitude of possibilities, the child does not have to solve the whole puzzle in one go. So if the child has a basic structure to work with that serves the immediate communicative need, then sort of through either adding new constructions or extending, generalizing to slightly more general possibilities, you can go quite a long distance, just that for many constructions it does not happen. So sort of the empiricist counter would be many of the possible structures that derivations can generate, can create, are simply unattested. Not because they're ungrammatical, but because people never use them.
So what?
But you were saying-
What does this mean, Bertus?
And hold on, you were, sorry, you were saying that there was an ungrammaticality, right? The example of the trade unionist. So what?
In giving people a sliding scale of how grammatical do you judge this, Verhagen had 7 variants that increasingly sort of departed from the prototype structure. And the deeper he went down that list, the more speakers rated examples as ungrammatical or unlikely on a scale of 1 to 5, closer to 1. And the final 2, of which the example I had up earlier was rated as 1, as simply ungrammatical. So, which is not predicted by derivational theory, but that's what the speaker said. So, to an empiricist, the question would be, this is part of the knowledge of language, that even though it's possible, it's not going to be used.
But I just think it's the classical distinction between competence and performance. It's like if I ask you what's 3,716 times 2,408, you cannot give me a straight answer. That doesn't mean that you don't have the competence to perform that kind of mathematical calculation, but it's just like in this particular situation, your memory capacity is probably not sufficient to perform that kind of mental operation. And for me, that's always, that's obviously not my analogy, I read it somewhere, but for me, it always made it so clear what the differences between competence and performance. And so performance, of course, performance can be considered part of language competence. Well, it sounds contradictory. of language ability, but it doesn't mean that that this distinction is not valid. Yeah, I was wondering about these examples as well, like that you had up earlier with the. I also don't know what it means because you changed your story. You said first that people judged it as ungrammatical, but then you said they judged it as increasingly unlikely.
The grammatical, well, it was a 1 to 5 scale. I can't remember what the question was, whether it was basically, do you find this acceptable on a scale of 1 to 5? And for those that deviated too far from the prototype that correlated with the corpus frequency, the ratings got lower and lower until it reached the point where they simply
got to
acceptability.
When I construct a Zulu sentence which has the word mfazi in it, I get speakers who just say, no, this is not acceptable. And that's not acceptable because the term mfazi is just not considered to be a polite expression for a woman in a discourse. And, so acceptability is a different judgment from grammaticality, I think. So.
Right, and if you're using that, then presumably colorless green ideas is also ungrammatical? Because it doesn't have a natural language? Then you cannot make up things that don't make sense. That's your... But we all know that we can make up things that don't make sense and we understand each other, so then what does ungrammaticality mean?
Perhaps I can come in here and start with a summary. As far as I understand it from Mark's position, he would be happy to concede that what the empiricists are dealing with is performance. And if they actually cared that their theory was a theory of performance, that would be fine and we could leave and go home and stop the argument. That's my sense. But I just would want to claim that what we're dealing with here is performance and competence, that distinction is a problematic one. So in a sense, that's actually where the argument falls around. Is that distinction?
I think if you look at that